Hey Westside, so in light of National Truth and Reconciliation Day, we wanted to share with you one of our old podcasts from about a year ago, a conversation between Holly and David, all on reconciliation and how the church can participate in it. So sit back and enjoy this meaningful, great conversation between the two.
This is the Westside King's Church podcast, where we aim to encounter and embody the surprising grace of Jesus.
So this is part two of our conversation around Rich Villodas' book, The Deeply Formed Life. We talked last week a little bit about it with Tyson and I, and we had Rich join us remotely, in that sense, just to chat through some of his experiences about why he wrote the book. And one of the things that really captured me in the book was the priority that he put on issues of race and reconciliation. And you maybe heard Tyson and I in the interview with Rich talk about how several of the issues in the book, which kind of get treated as secondary issues when it comes to issues of discipleship, Rich took and put as primary issues. And I found that hugely liberating. Like his opening line in the chapter on racial reconciliation for a divided world, he says, the real question of discipleship, of Christian discipleship, is not, can I be your brother in Christ? But can I be your brother-in-law? And he then says, I first heard this statement in a seminary class. Who can't your child marry? Who do you feel uneasy about having in your home? And these questions that get down to the sort of roots of our own racial issues and our own complexities. Now then, as somebody who is very much a newcomer to Canada, then learning as I've been here about the racial reconciliation needs of our own country, if you'll permit me to talk about it as our country, I'm happy for you to, let me know that I'm not allowed to say that just yet. But the question of where do we go dealing with our own history and our own issues of reconciliation and our own relationships around issues of race and difference, I found it really, really enlightening when I was reading Richie's book to say that these are things which are gospel-centered issues. I've always believed that they're huge issues for the gospel and central issues, and I found huge solidarity in hearing somebody put it so primarily within a book on Christian discipleship. So I wanted to focus on that for our second part of the conversation. I think it's both timely for us as Christians in Canada predominantly, as we are, but also important for us as a Christian community to think about. So that brings me then to introduce Holly, who is here with me today. Now, Holly is one of these people that as a pastor, you have immense privilege of bumping into just at the back of your church one day, which I think is how Holly and I met. And we just started chatting, and Holly was here at the very, very first Westside King's Church service ever. So she's in that select group of a few hundred people that were here on day one, and you're still with us 25 years later. Although we're talking to you today from the USA, I believe. But Holly, I promised Holly I wasn't going to give her a huge introduction, but would let her introduce herself, because we've both been in those situations where people give you a big introduction and you find yourself listening to it thinking, this person sounds amazing. And then you realize, oh, it's me. I could say a lot of brilliant things about Holly. I'd love her to introduce herself a little, because she has a lot more ability to be accurate in that. But Holly has really helped me in many ways, just guiding me towards a growing understanding and a growing learning base regarding the issues of reconciliation and Indigenous awareness within Canada. So when it came to this conversation, I was just thinking to myself, I've got to get Holly somehow into this conversation to guide us and help us. So Holly, welcome. It's great to have you with us this evening.
Oh, Pastor David Harvey. Well, I'm glad that we had the long conversation yesterday, because we got over the excitement that here we are together. So we had that. We've done with, we're just happy to be having this conversation, Yeah.
Totally. Totally. So Holly, so you are you have been at Westside for a lot of years. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what it is that you do. Perhaps some of our people that are with us today might have seen you on television recently. You were bouncing your way around a lot of my social media channels. I kept turning on, and somebody else is posting interviews of you from TV interviews. So tell us a little bit about what it is you do, and a little bit about yourself. Is that okay?
Yeah, yeah, let's dive in. Well, I have to say, it's proper protocol whenever we start off a meeting to do a land acknowledgement.
Mm,
And, because the word Canada, Kanata is a Cree word, which means clean and pure. And Canada is a Mohawk word, which means our home.
mm,
And, we are very diverse as the First People, coast to coast to coast. And the reason for the diversity is because we live totally off the land. All of our food, shelter, clothing, tools, toys, medicines, everything came from the land. So all of Canada is traditional territory for the First People.
mm,
And so, you know, that's why it's always proper protocol because, Canada has been here for a few hundred years, but we have been here for time immemorial. We believe that our people are the original people, and then we have been placed here by Creator.
mm,
And so, I'm a film producer as well. And so I'm doing a film that's going to be played at the Arctic Winter Games. So as the land acknowledgement is being spoken, there's a visual of the land. So I really love to think of when we're doing a land acknowledgement, it's just not this little ritual that we do, but we actually think of the land where we now work, live, and play,
mhm,
that who has been here. So where I'm speaking from today, I'm on the traditional territory of the Paiute people of southern Nevada,
mhm,
and I am in awe of the Paiute people because I think of, I go out to the desert, there's not an abundance of flora and fauna. There's how did they live here in these extreme temperatures? It's so hot right now, and I'm in air conditioning, but I'm thinking of, it's incredible. So I was in the grocery store and I met this man, and I could tell he was Native, and I was like, "Hey, bro," and, I see another Native, and we started talking. And his name is Phil. He's Apache, and I started talking to him. I was like, "How did your people live here? Like, you even more so. How did your people live on this territory?" And he goes, "What about your people living in the snow in northern Alberta? Like, I do not know how you guys lived up there." Because I am from Fort McKay First Nation, and my community is in northern Alberta. And my mother spent the first 6 years of her life living entirely off the land. There wasn't a store. She didn't speak a word of English, and they lived entirely off the land. And so I just love when we do land acknowledgements and we just think of who are the people that lived here for time immemorial, where we, do our business, where we do our homes, where we, play. And I love doing that.
mm. Yeah, that's and so actually, I almost want to ask you a question about that because you made a little comment in there. So I have been in contexts where land acknowledgements are given, and it does feel like, and forgive me, it feels like, oh, we've got to do this, so we're just going to do it
Yeah,
really quickly.
yeah.
And then I've also been in contexts where I find, wow, that's a really heartfelt and thoughtful sort of word that has been given there. Now, where, how does it feel for you because you must hear that even more than I hear that, like that kind of, you said just there, we don't want to just do it as a ritual, but to actually pause and spend some time and think about where we are and what we're doing.
Yeah, I did some research on that because I was like, I asked some friends, like, what does a land acknowledgement mean to you as an Indigenous person? And it was really, people saying, I see you. I
Hmm.
acknowledge that you're here. So it's a step in the right direction where we're not just like stumbling, through our nation going, we're forgetting about that this is somebody's home for time immemorial. Um, we actually have scientific evidence all the way from Arctic to Antarctica that we have been here for 30,000 years. Now, there's different theories about how we got here. The most common thought is that we came across a land bridge across the Bering Strait. So that would mean they were of Asian descent, or maybe Asians started here and went that way. But we do know that there is that scientific evidence. And we also know that we have origin stories of how we were created here, and that, Creator put us on this land for this time. And we are the original people here. So one of the stories is where we call present day North America, which is Canada, the United States, we call it Turtle Island. So whenever you hear the reference to Turtle Island, it's an Indigenous thought towards North America. And so I like when we take those pauses as maybe as mundane or ritual as it, at least we're doing that. I like when there's a little bit more personality and effort into it. I love when Canadians like to lean into the conversation, when I think of it, when Europeans first came over across the pond to Turtle Island, they couldn't live in one of the harshest countries in the world without assistance. It was, the First Nation people that were like, you know what, friend, you need to change your shoes and your clothing. You're going to get sick. And if you get sick, all the medicines come from land. And, here's your food sources. So Europeans depended on First Nations. Mm-hmm. So let's repeat that again. Europeans depended on First Nations, and that's the original relationship. And I think that, I have a lot of interviews, and people ask me a lot of times, like, what's the relationship with Indigenous people in the government, Canada Day, singing the national anthem? And I was like, it's severed. Honestly, it is. So we have a harsh relationship. And I know that a lot of us don't celebrate. And it's funny because we changed the lyrics of O Canada. We say, O Canada, our home on Native land. Mm-hmm. So you can do that too. But, but I wish that every Indigenous person had a great opportunity like I have to spend days with people like yourselves and the people on this call, because I'm hopeful. We've turned a corner. We honestly have. I see it. Today I did a big seminar for a whole bunch of people. Yesterday it was 300 lawyers out of Montreal and New York. And it's just amazing that people are leaning into the conversation. They're like, I really want to know about our First People. I want to learn about the true history of Indigenous people in Canada, and I want to learn how we can move forward. And so I do have a business that facilitates workshops of Indigenous awareness so that I can, help people like, industry, government, businesses, agencies, first responders, all sorts of organizations in those efforts. And then also I'm a filmmaker, because film has a far reach. Like, I'm teaching some people here, but the film we can just keep playing on over and over and over again, right? Yes. And so that's why film's important.
Yeah, no, and I've seen some of the work that you've done, and it's phenomenal, and I really appreciate all of the interactions. I feel like I maybe get lazy in my sort of work sometimes, because I could just reach out to you and say, Holly, what about this? And tell me what do you think about that?
Anytime. You are welcome anytime, friend.
And so for me, one of the things that's been interesting for me in this journey, I arrived in Canada having just completed a PhD in Galatians. And one of the things that is really central to the theology of Galatians is this idea which is of the equality of all people. So Paul, it doesn't matter whether you're Jew or Greek or slave or free or male and female, but we're all one in Christ. So there's this drive within the gospel. It's so I find myself drawn whenever people speak about reconciliation, when they speak about, bringing people to a place of equality, it always ticks within me, hopefully as a human, but also as a Bible scholar, that goes, yes, that's what Jesus is talking about. And so there's a line in Richie's book where he says, the gospel we proclaim must be big enough to engage the realities of racial fragmentation. Right? So
good.
Which is beautiful. I love that thought. But now what's interesting to me is that when we come to talk about the relationship, so you talked about, what's the relationship with the government? What's the relationship with, and it's severed. But of course, one of the challenging things, it seems to me, within the relationship between Indigenous people in Canada and Europeans or settlers, is the church has brought a lot of complexities into this. So the church don't come into this conversation neutral. The church actually would I be right to say, perceived as the perpetrators of a lot of the damage and difficulty to a relationship which started as one of dependency and became one of abuse and segregation and all of these sorts of things. So for me, what I then love whenever I have conversations about with you is your hopefulness as an Indigenous person and a Christian who has somehow navigated this with incredible grace, I think. So I'd love for you to chat a little bit about that, if you would, Holly, because your first comment talked about government relations and all that, but talk a little bit for a group of us in a church conversation. Where do you see the role of the church? Because we can talk about the theological role of the church, which to me is very much a call to reconciliation. But when we get down onto the ground, this is some difficult places to navigate, isn't it?
It really is. And you know what? My heart just exploded when you asked that. Like, I just thought, well, the conversation that we had yesterday, I remember asking you, like, why are you so cool? Like, why are you so conscious and interested in this? And like, I've been a Christian since 1982. So that's like, math is hard, like 127 years. I've been a Christian a long time. And honestly, you're the first pastor that has ever said, let's have a conversation about this. Ever. I mean, it's wonderful, but it's also sad. But I'm just so thankful to you. I honestly have. You've led this with such grace. I love the series that you did this winter with Rich. And by the way, you should have put me before him, because he's like, I mean, it's hard act to follow after hearing. I mean, I was like searching words when he's talking. He's so brilliant, and I just really loved his book. I love the conversation. And, but when I became a Christian, it's really interesting because it was almost like the church said either or. You're an Indigenous person or a Christian. You cannot be a First Nation person and a Christian. It's like opposing sides. And that didn't sit right with me. I was like, I was reading the Bible and it was saying the opposite, that I could embrace, because the church has been really ethnocentric. And that's a belief or assumption that your social or cultural group is superior. And so we don't do, there is no beauty or justice when we wrap the gospel in European culture, because we're missing out on all this, and, it was really interesting. I was, even it's even hard to talk about, but when I was first in the church for many years, people tried to cast out demons out of me, saying that I had generational curses, that my origin was, demonic or witchcraft, or, and it was just surprising to me that I am still in the church, because I found such comfort in my relationship with God. I found such comfort in reading scripture and studying the works of God. It just resonated so much with me. But, I was not raised that way because, like I mentioned a moment ago, my mom spent the first 6 years of her life being totally loved in a beautiful situation, in a family group, living traditionally. But when she was 6 years old, the RCMP came to her community, and it was Christmas time, and the river was frozen. They came by dog team, and they took her by force and her two little sisters, and they were kicking and screaming, and they took them. And the community was so shocked. My mother was 6, my auntie was 8, the little auntie was 4, and the 3 little girls left, and they never saw them again. And they had no idea where they went. And This old man told me, he said, I was there when your mom was stolen. I watched. And when they left, the whole community cried for days. The grief was enormous. I can't imagine. I'm a parent.
Mm.
I can't imagine someone coming to the door and knocking on the door and taking my children. And then they were instructed, if you ever see anybody coming down the river, again, you kids got to run and hide. So do you see that, how the anger and hurt built up? Well, my mom spent 13 years at Gruard Indian Residential School. She had no idea where home was. Home had no idea what that. And my mom experienced neglect and abuse. And the stories that we hear that come out of residential school are true. Of the neglect and abuse. And it was run by the Roman Catholic Church. There was no teachers. It was mostly, domestic duties and learning about the Catholic faith and the rituals of that. But when my mom turned 18, her funding ran out. So they put her on a bus and her ticket took her to Edmonton. She had never been out of that little compound of the mission school. She gets off on the streets of Edmonton. Well, of course, there's predators waiting. The RCMP were charging them a vagrancy. Vagrancy means they have no job, no home. They don't have money to pay for their fines. They don't understand the court system. And my mom said, residential school was tough, but getting dropped off on the streets was really a nightmare.
Mm.
And they call them survivors because 50% of the children got taken, never made it back home. And if you survived, 90% of survivors ended up with a mental illness, depression, anxiety, addictions to more severe forms. So, this is an ancient history. The last residential school in Canada closed in 1996. And so, we are impacted. All of us are impacted by this story. And so I think the whole nation was grieving a couple of weeks ago when we heard about the 215 children, some as young as 3 years old, that were found in an unmarked grave. But we were not surprised. We know that when they destroyed my mom's residential school, there was baby bones found underneath there. And so I grew up thinking, the church is the oppressor. They're against Indigenous people. And, when we think of it, despite and missiologists will agree on this, despite 500 years of missionary work, only 2 to 5% of Indigenous people are followers of Jesus, because the church was the oppressor. So as a church, we have to do differently. We have to think differently. We have to work towards reconciliation in that reconciliation, right? And I know that's a hard truth. I know that it's hard to hear this stuff because we've been really negligent in Canada on sharing these stories.
Yeah.
And I think that, Canada, you probably heard that even before you came here, Canada's nice. This maybe shows we're not so nice, right? And so I think that, the church has got to do different. It's got to be, yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's such a sobering story, Holly, and I'm sure anyone listening just, my daughter's 9, and I just can't even imagine what it'd be like to just be sat one day and somebody come in and take her and them have the legal power to do that and never to see her again. And I think for us, there's an ability sometimes to almost abstract ourselves from these stories. These are things that happened a long time ago and we didn't know any better. But there's both the journey of, actually, it wasn't really a long time ago. And then there's the journey of, and how do we put that back together? And I'm finding, as I'm learning, like it was just I saw you on that television interview a few weeks ago. It was the first time that I had heard that these residential schools didn't have any teachers. And I find myself thinking, why do we even call them schools? And I know that's a really small thing in the grand scheme of things, but I wonder how many people even realize that actually this wasn't education in the way that we would understand it. This would, it seems to me like it was an attempt to deprogram people, to change them, and so it strikes me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the challenge for us then as Christians is, generally speaking, when a person becomes a Christian, the sort of message that they get from the church is, oh, well, hey, if you're a classic settler, it's great that you're now a Christian. So this means you come to church on Sunday, and you maybe do some things that you used to not do, and you don't do some things that you used to do, right? But very rarely will anybody talk to you about your culture, your dress code, your language, these are things that you can just carry on doing. Whereas it's the history you're explaining for an Indigenous person who decides, I'd like to follow Jesus, is there's a new set of rules begin to appear, which is, well, you've got to stop being like you were. To hear you say that people were attempting to cast demons out of you just because you were an Indigenous lady is I don't even know what to say about that, Holly, but it's so sad because it's so wrong.
It is. And, I think that when I think of, people saying, well, that was a long time ago and I had nothing to do with it. The Bible tells us over and over again that, if one part of the body hurts, then we all hurt. And if we respond in any way other than compassion or love to people that are hurting, that are struggling, to the issues, then we have to, really look at our faith, and we have to take that approach. Like, I think I need to do a shift. I think that I need to, take a different look at it, for sure.
One of my favorite kind of thinkers about Paul and issues around the gospel in the New Testament is a recently passed away Ghanaian scholar called Lamin Sanneh, and what Sanneh did brilliantly in a lot of his work was pointed out how the gospel was a message without language, and so what Sanneh noticed was that a lot of the religions of the world required levels of cultural assimilation. So if you wanted to be, and let me not pick on any religions in that sense, but if you wanted to be this particular religion, here's the language you have to learn, here's the cultures you have to adopt, here, so to become this religion, you start to dress differently, speak different languages. He says, and what Sanneh found fascinating about Christianity is that Christianity works in any language and doesn't have, what does a Christian dress like? Nobody knows. What language does a Christian need to speak? Doesn't matter. You can say God in any language. The earliest Christians very quickly started translating documents so that you didn't have to step towards them. And all of this came out of Paul's work in the New Testament, where the big issue is Jews and Gentiles, and the Jewish people wanting the Gentiles to culturally assimilate to their version of Christianity. In Ephesians, Paul says, no, if there was a wall, Jesus has knocked it down. And he's brought Gentiles close as Gentiles, not as Jews. And Galatians is about the same sort of thing. And in 2 Corinthians, and this is what just strikes me as interesting, is that Paul then turns to the church there and says, oh, and not only has God brought us all together, he then has given us a ministry of reconciliation. And so this is one of the calls of the church, is a ministry of reconciliation. And now it's easy for us to spiritualize that and say, well, that's just about us and God. But actually, Paul's talking about us and God, and us and our fellow humans that are called to reconcile. So when I'm listening to you talk, I can't help but think of a scholar like Sanneh pointing out that it's unnecessary to get involved in cultural assimilation when you teach the gospel, because the gospel will meet people wherever they are. Yes. Jesus came to us as a Jewish rabbi. Why? Because he was born in Israel, and that was a way that you could teach well, as if you came in that way. He didn't ask people to adopt a way of understanding him, but he he just fitted in the culture he was in. So I suppose my question for you is, so you spend a lot of time as an educator, as somebody who helps raise awareness. You're talking to a group of people in a church context as a Christian. And then I want to say, and forgive me if this sounds patronizing, Holly, like I as a pastor, I talk to a lot of people who walk away from faith and walk away from the church. And I think I could say most of them won't have even close to the volume of excuses that you would have to walk away from faith in the church. And yet here you are, long-time member at our church, Christianity that goes beyond that. And I'm sure all of us listening, and please, I don't want this to sound patronizing, but wow would be some of our thoughts, because you could be totally forgiven, like, for going, wait a minute, I'm not having anything to do with this. So with that in mind of your journey, Paul's encouragement of a ministry of reconciliation, how would you help us as a group of Christians who are interested in living out the gospel and aware of the fact that for us to live out the gospel in Canada today, we need to think about the damage that has been done in the name of the gospel, but then also just the damage that has been done, in this nation in that sense? Would you have, I'm asking you at some level to tap into the training that you do on a regular basis, and sort of what are the sort of things that you would guide us as individuals to start thinking about? And that can be really practical if you want, or very theoretical, and even simple things. Like I find myself, I know that I've talked to you about this before, just even wanting to be careful around language that I use, because I realize that I hear language and realize, well, that can't be the right thing to say, but not sure how to talk, and then worrying about saying anything. So yeah, can I ask you just to sort of give us some, if you feel comfortable doing that, some sort of guidance on?
I love it. Well, first of all, I want to say that, I love what you just said about, um, that scholar and about reconciliation. And, reconciliation is a buzzword in Canada right now, because what happened was there was 3 commissioners that went across Canada, and they took a team and they listened to 7,000 survivor stories. Could you imagine, start to finish?
Wow.
The enormous task of that. And they compiled a report. And, I'm just in awe of them. When Senator Murray Sinclair submitted the report, he went, "Here, Canada, here's the report. Now let's be friends." And I echo that sentiment. And, for one thing, I think our people have gone through so much. I mean, I think of the stories that I've carried, the negative experiences that I've carried as an Indigenous woman. The whole issue with the murder of missing Indigenous women and girls, we're a vulnerable demographic where, the numbers are disproportional rate of us experience a violent episode. Like there's just so much that we carry, and we have a lot of hurt and a lot of anger. And, despite everything that we went through, and I was talking about this recently with my daughter, because we were talking about, my daughter is an Indigenous lawyer. She goes to Westside too. And, we were talking about how many really like amazing Indigenous people I know, that we know, and the great success we have, how kind we are, how generous we are, how full of fun and laughter despite everything that we've gone through. That's who we are. And it's just amazing to me. And I really think the root of that is because it's very rare that you meet an Indigenous person who's an atheist. We have a really strong connection to Creator because of our connection to creation. In all of our languages, we have a word that says Creator. And so in Cree, it's Kichimanitu, which means the great spirit. And so we have that connection. And so I feel that we have, that relationship with God already. We're coming in where you don't have to say, there is a God. We're like, we know for time immemorial that there's a God. But when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission submitted the report, I was at the unpacking. I know all the stories. And I know too many stories, and for one person to hold, I think. I'm not sounding like a victim or anything, but there's a lot of stories that are really hard to take. But within that, people are like, okay, how do I do it? How do I do reconciliation? And I would say, let's all start saying, by reconciliation starts with me. And the part of that report says the truth and reconciliation. So there's a truth. So how do you learn that? Well, read books. If wherever you get your books, type in keywords, Amazon, Indigo, wherever it may be, and type up keywords and pull up books and start doing the research yourself, or podcasts or audiobooks, whatever is more works for you. I would say I have a stack of books here because I'm teaching from here. But I would say most Canadians don't know about the Indian Act. This is a really good reference. It's 21 things you may not know about the Indian Act. We can put all these books in the link. And this talks about this. The Canadian Indian Act was created in 1876. And what it did is it separated Canada from us. So we were totally separate. And then we have a government department. We're the only ethnicity that has a government department. And there was all these rules under there. And Canadians don't know how oppressive that was. So I think if Canadians understood this would be a real benefit. And then there's some, this book is my new favorite. It's called Indigenous Rights by Chelsea Bowell. I love that her last name is Bowell and she's right. But there's tons of footnotes after every chapter. It's really, you can stay in there forever. And the other thing is listen to our music. We have great music, whatever your genre is. Watch our films. I grew up in the old days when there was cowboy and Indians, and we were seen as the villain, and circle the wagon, will scalp, the innocent people. And that created a lot of unconscious biases in people. And I experienced racism where people were like, you savages, or what are you going to do, scalp us? And, people, were quite racist because of those movies. And I love now that I can work in movies. I've been even a native advisor on film, where if there's anything historical, inaccurate, or culturally offensive, we make revisions. And so watch those films. The other thing is, what I do and I love to do is, and I suggest, is go to museums and cultural sites. That's how I'm learning about the Paiute people in the desert. That's how, when I travel, I always tack on an extra day to find out whose traditional territory I am on and learn about the people. And the other thing is, buy our art, wear it, display it, use it. But the rule with art is buy from inspired Indigenous, not Indigenous inspired. Therefore, you're appreciating culture, not appropriating culture, right? And the other thing is, we have this harsh history, we have historical trauma, but let's not focus on that, because whatever we focus on gets bigger. And so let's look at Indigenous success. We have amazing artists, business people, politicians, athletes, chefs, lawyers, like my daughter. And when I think of my daughter too, like, my mother could not even go to university because of the Indian Act. She couldn't even hire a lawyer because of the Indian Act. And now her granddaughter is a lawyer. Wow. And so, let's look at all those successes, and let's stop saying, please, church, let's stop saying, what can I do for Indigenous people? Let's stop saying that. And let's start saying, what can I learn from Indigenous people? We're not a problem to be solved. Right. And so I think that if we could all just start saying reconciliation starts with me, it would really take us further, that we get to places that we haven't been before. And, I think of Malachi 1:11, and it says, my name will be great among all the nations, from as long as the sun rises and the sun sets. And then in Revelation 7:9, it says that there'll be every tribe, every language, every culture, all around the throne. So the Bible says we're all inclusive.
Mhm.
And when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we're saying, oh, we see that we're diverse, we include you, but the word that we should tack on that is belonging,
Mhm.
diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And so I don't know, those are just some tips that,
Yes.
to help us to get started within that. And, that we may as a church respond differently and don't look at us as a mission field, look at us as your neighbors.
Mm.
And a lot of us have, had, some struggles. We may be in the fallout from that, from
Mm.
the ripple effect of that. And let's have compassion for that. A lot of our communities are in poverty. There's 634 First Nations in Canada, and about 600 of them are in third world conditions. And, maybe we have the same compassion for other, underdeveloped countries that we have in Canada. And often we see a situation of in poverty and we go, ooh, like go
Mhm.
get a job or go to school. But poverty has a stranglehold. It takes a hard time, it takes a lot to get out of it. And we may not have the resources, we may not have internet or the devices
Mm.
or, gas money to go get that. And if your family's in poverty, there's probably, crisis at home. It's a triage. You need to, deal with that
Mm.
first. And so I think that, we need to start looking more with compassion, as the Bible instructs us, with love,
Mhm.
praying for shalom.
Mm.
That's my word right now for, peace, wellness, blessings.
Mm.
May Indigenous people see God who he really is and
Mm.
not how it's been presented by the oppressor.
Mhm. No, and that's shalom's one of my favorite words in
Is it?
scripture. So
Oh, yay.
yes.
What does it mean to
Um,
you?
so well, it's interesting for me that you bring it up, the word shalom, because it often gets translated peace, right? That is a pretty common translation of it. But as is often the case, and I don't need to tell you this, but culture use these words, and when we translate them into another culture, you might go, well, yeah, okay, that word kind of does that mean that, but what the word means in this to this group of people and what the word means to this group of people can be still very different things. So we tend to hear peace, in my context, peace is no fighting, everybody's kind of tolerating each other. I grew up in Scotland where we had quite a lot of displaced Protestants as a result of the Northern Ireland Catholic Protestant tension. So peace was often about just not bombing each other and not having terrorism. In the Hebrew Bible, shalom is the notion of wholeness,
Mhm.
and I really love that, which of course has to include Western notions of peace. But if you actually look at how the Bible talks about shalom, you see it translated as prosperity, you see it translated as peace. But I think one of the closest references to the Hebrew notion is this idea of wholeness, a place where there is no division anymore, where everything is as it should be. And so in this conversation, the idea of shalom to me is a beautiful belief, a beautiful hopefulness to say, actually, what would it look like? And I think this is the question that the prophetic call of Scripture calls us to, is to look at any space and say, what does wholeness look like here? Um,
Mhm.
the text that for me is one of these texts that I can't get away from as one of the pastors at Westside is Jeremiah 29:7, where this group of people are instructed, and they're essentially settlers. Well, they're not quite settlers; they're exiles in a foreign land, and God calls them to seek the wholeness, the shalom of the city where they are. And so I find myself often thinking that our call of the church is to say, what does wholeness look like here? And sometimes the only way to find that wholeness is to start asking questions. It's, where is there brokenness? Where and how have things been broken? And how are things to be put right again? And I think there's a tendency. I've said it to you privately before. I think people might know this. I come from a missionary kid background, and so I've seen the effect of missionaries going to other countries and assuming that they can arrive with all of the solutions. So if I can put a little bit of a crass point on it, but I grew up in a culture where it was, hey, the white people are here, now everything's going to be okay, right? And of course, actually, quite often what happened was everything was worse as a result of just cultural deafness, just inconsistent understandings of what's going on. So I find there's something beautiful in the notion of listening, of actually spending time, even as the church, and being brave enough, and perhaps is it humble enough to assume that we don't have the answers, and maybe nobody's asking us for the answers, but rather, what does it look like to become neighbors? What does it look like to see wholeness in that sense? Because I loved what you said, that if we perceive, as somebody who now lives in Canada, if I perceive my Indigenous neighbor as somebody that I need to fix or a problem that I need to solve, then I'm not treating them in a neighborly way, but actually I've gone back to the problem that maybe got us into this situation in the first place, was perceiving not that relationship of dependency that started in the early days, as you say, but rather this new and unhealthy relationship. So, goodness, it's it's one of these things that I find so heavy, and what often happens, I think, when it comes to heavy things and things where perhaps apologies are needed to be made, that we have a tendency, at least this has been my experience, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but my experience seems to be that what happens to us is that when something seems big and we don't know what to do, it's easier for us to run away from it and just pretend that there's not anything there, and almost
Or else
ignore.
saying, when in doubt, throw it out.
Yes, yes, yeah.
Yeah. Like, and that's what the church does. You're
Mhm.
like, we're not sure about that. Oh, when in doubt, throw it out. Right.
Yes.
Instead of going, that might be, a blessing to our people, or a blessing
Mhm.
to our congregation, or, we can learn from this. We can
Mhm.
listen, we can build relationship.
Yes, and I think that's quite something to think about, because it's a change. And this is, for me, this is quite important for us as a church, that we've chosen to think a lot more about this word justice these days. And I think it's really important that we hold on to this word, because there's a tendency to utilize this word mission very often, and mission has a lot of baggage attached to it as a word, and it implies this almost subtle. I was talking to somebody from our congregation recently, who was saying it sounds quite colonial. Actually, we're going to go from where we are to somewhere else with all of the answers and show you how to do things. Whereas this question of justice seems to rest on this notion of shalom, and said actually is that what is right. And I love that in Micah 6:8. That God wants us to do what is right. And of course, sometimes doing what is right involves apologizing for what was wrong. It involves, seeking to correct the injustices that have happened. So let me ask you some of the questions then. So what's your sort of advice for those of us then on an individual level? Because I think, you and I have talked, Holly, about the challenges of trying to live out, your faith and your authenticity as an Indigenous woman. You encounter, you've talked to me about encountering microaggressions on a regular basis, where, do you want to talk about that? Is that something you could help us with? Because even sometimes when people with quote unquote good intentions, their way of framing it can actually be hugely unhelpful sometimes, can't it?
Yeah, and I love this, and I love the whole conversation that you had in the church, and you've addressed this a lot. And racism is an uncomfortable conversation, because
Mhm.
it almost feels like your goodness is being attacked when you're,
Mhm.
and even a racist will say, I'm not racist because I'm not wearing a white hood, right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so, you and I have talked about authors that we liked, and I like the phrase from Abraham X Kennedy X.
Kendry, yes.
Yeah, him, where he says, let's be actively anti-racist.
Mhm.
And I love that notion. And I love to be a student of this, because I
Mhm.
realize that, I have to learn too. Even though I do anti-racism work, I want to learn. So I
Mhm.
have journals, I write notes, I listen to panels and podcasts and audiobooks. And there is some words that are abrasive that a lot of people don't like to receive. Like there's even leaders in Canada that have said there's no systemic racism. And, if we break it down, there is systems in place in Canada that were for Indigenous people. Read the Indian Act. That was a system that was in place. The taking the children, it was a law. If you're an Indian child aged 6 to 16, it was mandatory by law for you to attend Indian residential school. That was a system that was in place. And so, and the other word that's really hard is when people talk about white privilege. And people go, well, I'm not privileged. My family came over and we worked really hard and, to where we're at now. And I'm like, that's class privilege. We're talking about color of skin privilege. Because unless you're like Black or brown, like Black and brown people always, or Black and Indigenous people always stand in solidarity because of colonial structures. So we have the acronym BIPOC. And so we experience things because of the color of our skin, like, being followed around in a store, being refused, walking into a restaurant, can we have a table for 4? And they're like, we have no room, when clearly there's room. If you have an Indigenous sounding last name, you doctor it up so you can get a job or a hotel reservation or a car rental. There's even things like microaggressions. And I asked some friends, what are those? Because these are like not overt forms of racism. And it was so funny because we all agree on this. And this happens to me regularly, where people say to me, you don't look like, sound like, act like, whatever, like, live like an Indigenous woman. And it's almost like, are you trying to compliment me? Because it's really dissing me and my people. And so I think that we have to like look at that. And now is the time. There's so much out there. I think that because we were all shut down at home, we were all glued to the news during the pandemic, and we all witnessed the knee on the neck of George Floyd, and then Black Lives Matter and everything that erupted from that. And I think that, it was really challenging for us, but at the same time, we keep getting reminded over and over again. And when the 215 children were found at Kamloops, I think that there was a shift. And there's been in the same week, there was other graveyards that were found, burial sites, unmarked graves of children in residential schools that were found since then that weren't like that big in the news, but it's happening. And I think that we can all relate. We're all parents or aunties or friends. And, we can't imagine what those children went through. And not just the children that died, which is so sad to me. They didn't have a mother comforting them, a daddy comforting them, whatever they went through. But also think of the children that were left, that watched, that saw, that probably had to dig those graves, right? And so what about those children? And I think that there was a national grief that when we saw that, and I think that we need to start having a shift. Now is the time. Something woke up in all of us. And I think that now is the time. And, just start doing our work. Just start praying. Just, start studying scriptures. Like, Pastor, what's the scripture from Amos where it says, where God's saying, you know what I want? You know what all I want? I want justice.
Yes, you put me on the spot to remember a verse.
You know what I had? Anyways, let's paraphrase. Rivers of mercy, oceans of justice, right? Yeah. And so that's what he wants. And that's what we should want. And, like even for me having this conversation with you, we're doing it. This is what we're doing. And I'm so proud of you for inviting me in. And we didn't have any agenda. We were just like, I was like, hey, what questions are you asking me? Like, what are we talking about? And you're like, let's just see. And I'm just like, okay, this is scary, but fun and a privilege. and I'm really proud of you for that. And
Well, thank
I
you.
think as a church, just keep going.
Mhm.
It's just keep going. There's no solutions other than, everybody just doing their own work
Yes.
and doing their own shifts. Let's just change how we respond.
And I appreciate, because I always feel slightly apprehensive, if I'm honest, Holly, is that, when you talk about like systemic racism and privilege, there's even a sense where I feel sometimes like the white guy going, well, now it's your job, Holly, to help me understand what I should be doing better. And so I'm still exerting and I please hope it never comes across that way, because genuinely for me, it's been a journey of wanting to learn and understand. But I really appreciated how you explained it there, because I think for many of us, we're aware that there's systemic racism, but then we might encounter people who want to deny that. And you find yourself struggling. Well, how do I explain that? How do I point that out? And I think what you've even given to us there is some really clear, well, if there's a system and the system doesn't treat people equally, then that's systemic racism. And like for me, that was, I don't know if any of our other listeners found that, but I just thought, wow, that's really clear way to, if you can point at a government act that says we're not going to treat everybody the same based on the color of their skin or based on where they were born or based on the family they were born into, then we're in a system of systemic problems, aren't we, in that sense? And I think these words are important to disempower at some level, because they become toxic words for certain people. So we hear, I think sometimes as a white person, I hear about white privilege, and there's a sense in which people want to defend that, and exactly as you said, no, that's not true. And the learning process of how do I be quiet in that and just to appreciate, I've been talking to friends recently, friends in Calgary, Black friends of mine in Calgary, and their experience of being stopped by the police and what goes through their mind at a police stop, and my experience of being stopped by the police are completely different things. And they're what they're worried about versus what I'm worried about are entirely different. And so for me, being, it always sounds terrible to say, use the word humble about yourself, but I have to humble myself and listen at this stage, because I have to understand that my own experiences don't relate to the experiences of Black brothers and sisters, Indigenous brothers and sisters who would say, yeah, no, this is real for us. This is a different sequence of things to be concerned about. So I really appreciate the way that you shared that, and encourage us to think about justice, and encourage us to think about where we position ourselves in that, and how we learn to listen as Jesus followers, and because I believe that the Bible calls us to this sort of work. It's even interesting how often in Jesus's ministry, listening is such a primary part of the ministry of Jesus, but you don't hear it preached about very often. It's even interesting that Jesus encounters people who are sick, and he asks them, well, what do you want me to do? and just, and I've even heard preachers say, well, this is a ridiculous question from Jesus. Of course, he knows what he needs to do for this person. But the power of Jesus himself saying, no, I'm here to listen first. You tell me what it is that you need in that sense. I think there's something beautiful about that.
He's so cool. I mean, I love him. Yeah, we learn constantly from him how we are to be, and I get great comfort thinking that Jesus was brown, right? And so
Yes.
like he's like one of us. And so I'm really, hopeful of that. And I think, I belong to an organization called the North America Institute of Indigenous Theologians. They're all Indigenous people who are PhDs, and we have these conversations. They're like you and Rich. They're super smart and theologians, and I'm just along for this beautiful journey with them. And I'm on the board, and we have these great conversations about, being an Indigenous person, and how we can help other people journey with us. And you said it exactly right. It's listening.
Mm.
It's listening. So, that listening and learning is really a huge thing. It's really the key.
Holly, thank you so much for spending some time with us. We really are appreciative of it this evening. I know I knew I was going to enjoy being in a conversation with you, so I'm not surprised, but I'm sure that everybody else has thoroughly appreciated it as well. So thank you so much.
It's the biggest honor for me to have a friendship with you, that you're my pastor, and that I've been waiting my entire Christian life for this. And so I am here for you, and let's journey this together. And I can't wait to see you in church.
Yes, absolutely.
And I want to say thank you for everybody that's listening.
Mm.
I just really appreciate it more than you'll ever know, for watching, listening, and maybe we can put like my website or my mom's. I did a documentary on my mom's residential school story, and I do have an online training, an Indigenous awareness training through my website, and maybe we can put some books or whatever it may be, like just some support and resources for people.
I love that. Well, anything you send over to me, Holly, we will put in the show notes for the podcast, and then we'll also email it to everyone that was registered for the seminar this evening as well, so that we can connect with that. So thank you so much.